So, Doug, thanks for taking the time to talk with us today. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks, Michael. It's a good day.
Perfect. Well, let's just jump straight in. We're talking about your book, Cultural Insights for Christian Leaders, New Directions for Organizations Serving God's Mission. You can't do any better than that. So maybe the first question I have is not necessarily about your writing. It's at the preface of the book, which is part of a series by Baker Press called Mission and Global Community. It discusses a changing landscape. Now, I think a lot of us might know what that is, but I'd like to give you a chance to maybe discuss that changing landscape for our readers.
Good. Thanks, Michael. I think one of the things that we had in mind when we proposed the series, the general editors are Scott Sundquist and Amos Young from Fuller Seminary, my colleagues, was to look at some of the major forces and dynamics and global issues that are pushing missions and churches today, and trying to bring fresh thoughts, but also disciplined thought around each of these issues as we see them. And it was allocated to the faculty and to our colleagues to contribute to that. So the first in this series looks at the question of Islam and our witness as Christians in the Islamic world. And my colleague Eveline Reisecker wrote a wonderful book on joyful witness amongst Muslims. And in it, she talked about some of the ways that we approach people of other faiths, and particularly Muslims, and how do we understand that? How do we interact with them? And it's a wonderful book in that whole area. The second in the series was written by another colleague, Bryant Myers, on the idea of globalization and what does it really entail? What do we mean by globalization, and what are the implications? What impacts does globalization have on believers, on faith, on Christians, on culture, economics? And it's a wonderful introduction to how we think Christianly about the concept of globalization. In my case, I was looking at the growing challenge of leadership in a diverse world, and how do we begin to understand our organizations, be they Christian organizations or organizations in general, from the influence of various cultures. I use that in the plural sense because there are more than one culture. There's more than one culture that impacts our organization. So I explored that and looked particularly on in areas of cultural anthropology and cognitive anthropology, and what were we learning from those disciplines that could speak into our understanding of our organizations, and how do we think about that from the perspective of God's mission. And there are others coming up, arts and culture, and others that will come up in the series. But it's a way of thinking about some of the major influences on our Christian life and our Christian experience, our churches and our Christian organizations, and to do it in such a way that points us back to God's mission in the world.
Perfect. Thank you so much. While we're talking about defining things, at the beginning of your book, you discuss thinking missiologically. Hope I said that all right. You go into definitions of mission, missions, and missional. And, when I'm in a good dialogue, I always know that we have all of our definitions assigned to us first. So maybe you could explain those terms because they're used so interchangeably these days.
Yeah, they really are. And it's interesting, all of us in the series and all of us who teach in the area of missions are constantly trying to clarify, because you can get a little confusion going. So let's start with the singular form, mission, and we're talking about primarily God's mission in the world, and that is God's mission to redeem the world. God's overarching plan to redeem and to restore his creation and our experience. And so when we talk about the mission of God, we're talking principally of God's redeeming work in the world. We also use that singular mission of people or God's those who are called by God to serve that mission. So it can be an individual and their mission as part of God's overall mission, or an organization like Edge of Faith magazine, or Pioneers, or Fuller Seminary, or whoever it happens to be. We talk about their mission as being part of that redemptive purpose of God. So that's the singular. When we use it in a plural sense, missions, we're talking about organizations or groups of people who are committed to serving God's mission, and their mission societies or missionary societies or nonprofit organizations that are working in serving God globally. So, for example, this past week, for 3 days, I attended the Missio Nexus conference, and it was a conference for mission leaders, and it brought together people from over 300 missions in the United States and Canada. So it was a
Wow.
fantastic opportunity to get to talk, and I had a chance to meet many of my old friends. I was a missionary for 20 years, and I've been in the academy for about 27 years. So it was great to catch up with them, to talk to other people. But each of those missionary societies or mission groups has a purpose, has a calling that is unique to themselves and part of God's mission. But we refer to that as missions. The term missional has been used in various ways, but it's most often used, at least in North America, to reflect of the purpose of the church to engage with God's mission in the world. So you talk about the missional purpose of the church, and that is worship and bringing people, discipling people, but also reaching out and serving the community around and evangelistically with care and concern and ministries of caring for the wider world and the wider group of people around them. So we would talk about that being missional. So missional is kind of the purpose of getting involved in it, or the action of getting involved in that kind of mission in a missional way. So that's the way those are used. And then missionary is reflected in a person who is sent. So we mean one who is sent in mission.
Perfect. Thank you so much. As a global mission advisor and leader, and as you said, involved in missions for over 20 years, I would have to think that you have at least one story, maybe two, that you might be able to share with us. Maybe even something that first opened your eyes to the cultural differences around the world, especially with Christians.
Yeah, the problem would be selecting one or two, but let me
go with more.
Early yeah, well, let me start with one of the earliest ones. My wife and I were called to be in missions immediately after university. So once we left university, we went overseas initially with the government of Australia, and we were in the teaching service there, and then subsequently we joined a mission society. And went to Papua New Guinea in the South Pacific, where we worked for a number of years. And when we first got to Papua New Guinea, we arrived in a fairly isolated area. We went in by a single-engine aircraft. There was nobody to drive in, so that gives you an idea of the isolation of it. And when we got there, we began to recognize just extreme differences in the cultures, clothing, food, interaction with one another, languages, and those kinds of things. But as I participated in the local Christian community and went to church, it dawned on me that it was more than just the outward appearance that was going on. There were actually questions that were being posed of who is God, and how do we understand God, and how do I understand God's redemptive purpose and God's work in my life or the life of the church. And so some of the things that they were wrestling with were questions of how do you live in peace with those who are your lifelong enemies? How do you reconcile with one another? What are the issues of reconciliation? And tribal warfare had been a constant through the years and through the decades and centuries. And how does one bring peace to that? And probably in that area, one of the most well-known stories of dealing with that issue was written by Don Richardson. It's called Peace Child. It's an older work now from his early days on the island of Papua, and his wrestling with that idea of how do you bring peace between warring nations. Well, that was very much part of the conversation of the church there. Another thing is that men and women did not interact with one another in a public domain, and so when we got to the church, there was a men's section on one side of the church, and then there was a little wall, and then the other side of the church was the women's section, and in the women's section, the children would sit and any animals that they wanted to protect. And so it was quite a lively side, whereas the men's side was quite a bit less lively. I had two daughters at the time, and my wife, and they really enjoyed going, and it was very different in my experience on the other side of the wall. So, but those are the kinds of ways the gospel becomes flesh, becomes real in various cultural settings. And one of the exciting things about Christianity and about Christianity through the ages is that the gospel has gone from one culture to another culture. And in so doing, it has adapted to that culture. It's spoken, if you will, incarnated the truth of the gospel in that new context. Well, fast forward, that was my early career. Fast forward to a time when I was a mission director and traveling a lot internationally. And one of the things that I discovered was that those issues could become extremely complex and trying to understand. I remember many years ago leading a team to Vietnam, and we were meeting with both local believers, but also with the government. We were working with the university system that was just emerging as a private university system, and we were talking to educators about the types of education that would be appropriate and perhaps more contemporary projects. And in talking to them and in working with them, we recognized that the church there really struggled with how do we interact with a dominant political system that is, in that case, was the communist system. How do we interact with the church, and what does the church do? How do they take on that authoritarian government, in particular when it is not favorable or providing support for the church? And so the church is kind of outside of that particular cultural or that particular governmental rule, and the challenges that the church faced about talking about who were members and who were not members, and how openly should they share the gospel, and what happens when people convert, and how do I handle that? And similar kinds of things happen in societies where you have, like Singapore, where you have multiple recognized religions, and to keep the harmony and peace, conversion is not appropriate. So how do you handle your evangelistic mandate? How do you work with that? So the idea of Christians globally dealing with different issues is a reality, and has been since the very beginning of the church's spread through these centuries.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for the stories. Those are wonderful, and some of the insights as well. So I guess my next question is, later on in the book, as I was reading Cultural Insights, you discussed learning cultural naturally, and I thought this was and that was, I think, actually the title of that chapter, and I found it really interesting. You discussed imitation and mimicry, and maybe that caught my eye because I have a biology background, and ritual later. So I would love it if you could expound a bit on all of those concepts and why they're important.
Right. Well, Michael, one of the things that I found interesting is I studied anthropology under Christian anthropologists like Chuck Kraft and Paul Hebert, and Hebert particularly, who was a wonderful Christian missionary, but also an outstanding anthropologist. wrestled with issues of worldview and how do people share a common view of the world, and how do they approach that. And we learned a great deal from that. But one of the things that I wrestled with all along was I can understand how a group formulates their understanding of culture, how that is communicated and upheld as a cultural value, a social value. It becomes just part of the water that everybody swims in, if you will. But my question was, how do we learn that? How do individuals actually learn that? And what is the individual who has a brain and a body, the embodiment of the human person? How does that physicality engage with that culture, and how does it formulate that? So I found a lot of helpful insights in the whole area of cognitive anthropology and some of the advances that are going on in understanding the brain and brain research and how we as human beings are not only nurtured, but what is our nature? How are we biologically and physiologically? And so part of that dynamic is that our bodies and our brains are really set up to learn from others, and they've discovered things within the brain that are receptive, if you will, and process other experiences through observation and watching that. One area of that is when you see someone else do something, you're more inclined to be able to copy that, to be able to want to mimic it or to replicate it. And it makes you that receptivity is then engaging you into that behavior, which is part of that bigger cultural experience. Not only that, but we also have the capacity to assess and assign feelings to that or understanding to that, because in some cases we've had that same experience ourselves, or we liken it unto how we've experienced something, and it's a kind of a solidarity that takes place there. And further research into the area of how we think has supported that understanding that, in fact, interacting with others and watching others, that's part of the process of being human. And culture is kind of that expression or that outcome of that interaction between human beings. So one of the things that does is it all of a sudden says, now, wait a minute, if that's the case, then this is a natural phenomenon. I mean, this is something that just happens. It happens by virtue of who we are as human beings. And part of that is being able to allow ourselves to do that exposure, intersection with it. Anthropologists have long talked about being a participant and an observer. If you want to learn, you not only have to study it or observe it, but you really need to get involved in it. So that kind of receptivity feeds our understanding of culture. So that's a little bit of the complex behind that. But how does that then work out? Well, it gives emphasis to participation in things like ritual, games, art, music, obviously language. And the more we engage with that, the more we not only learn of those cultures and learn those things, but in fact, we also help shape them as well. It's a kind of dynamic process that goes both ways. And that can be illustrated in a number of ways. You know as well as I do, if you're sitting in a room in the evening and somebody yawns, the next thing you know, everybody in the room is yawning. Or the first person who jumps up after a performance and starts clapping, and then everybody stands up and starts clapping. I watched that on Saturday night in a gathering I attended. But it's the kind of social embrace and social invitation that allows you to get involved. So all that to say that one of the things that we have to be aware of is that people are learning culture and people are shaping culture in every walk of life and in every area of life. And part of our desire, if we're trying to learn new culture, is to make those opportunities and to further those experiences for people and make it possible that we can continue to do that.
That's beautiful. You know, it's just amazing to watch how we think we're so different from each other, and yet God has made us really so similar and truly made us relational to one another, it makes you understand how easy it is to sew us up together and all be one in Christ Jesus, doesn't it?
Yeah, it really does. I honestly, I have come through writing this book and reading in these areas, and it has just given me a whole new appreciation for the wonder of creation and the wonder of human beings as created ones. It's thrilling to see that, and particularly now we talked earlier about grandchildren, watching my young grandchildren learn and fit in and experiment with what's acceptable and what's not. And me watching my daughters and my son-in-laws trying to guide that as well. It gives me a whole new appreciation for the wonder of God's creation and how God has equipped us to learn and to grow.
Absolutely. You just have to find that one perfect child and then they'll all mimic it. Or not.
I haven't found that child yet. I was teased that my kids are close to it, but no. Yeah.
Absolutely. So I guess we're coming up close to the end of the interview. Do you have any final thoughts you'd like to leave the reader?
This book was really looking at how we learn and process culture, and how, as leaders, we need to help our organizations wrestle through some of the diversity and some of the intercultural, both opportunities but also challenges that face us. Andrew Walls, one of my favorite historians, said that Christianity is in an ongoing dialogue with culture, and it's been true since the first century. And one of the things that I hope that leaders and those who are responsible for Christian organizations will take time to think about: how are the cultures that we live in, the culture, the local culture, the global culture, the subcultures, for example, different ethnicities and other things that make up my organization and the people we serve, how do we learn from one another, and how do we take opportunity to move beyond stereotypes or labeling and begin to genuinely learn from one another? Because God is at work in all of us, and God is at work in the world. And so how do we begin to understand those cultures and make opportunity for that, so that we actually see them as opportunities for growth? And even when the challenges are there, and there are many to be faced, how do we work through that with a way that is redemptive, touching base back again with God's mission in the world? So that would be my hope, that leaders become more sensitive to the role of culture and in many ways the wonder.
Absolutely. Well, Doug, thank you once again for talking to us and sharing some of your insights. And just thank you also for writing the book.
My pleasure. My pleasure. And it is available through Baker Publisher and through stores. So I look forward to interacting with people when they've read it.
Perfect.